Welcome everyone to the last panel. I think we're going to pick up. I think at least the third piece of the puzzle, or maybe fourth after Neil's discussion, which is this morning we talked about devolving the state and the role of the state and urban governance and urban government, and had some discussion about the role of urban government and its response to urbanization and the sort of tension between the discussion of the design of the system, metropolitan governance, regional governance, local governance, the tension between local autonomy maybe not being the ideal and not to romanticize that, and at the same time how one balances that need for local government with dealing with the larger forces shaping urbanization. So we took it from a kind of government perspective. I think then we heard a discussion, the panel before this, really about inclusive government and agency, sort of the ways that inclusion, community participation, how the political system is addressing or does not address inclusion, and the ways that it can be shaped and formed to be responsive and pushed. And I think the final panel today is about, I guess, a third leg of this, which is governing through partnerships, which are the various non-governmental organizations, whether that's foundations, whether it's the private sector, and the role that they play in urbanization and in this question of governance. And I think there are just a few things I'll open up and then turn to my colleague to frame this, because a number of kind of issues have been raised about what role these different sectors can play. Of course, Gerald Frug raised this morning, I think, the question of who designs the system, who decides, and how does one go about really designing this system of the proper role and structure of government or of governance. And we heard, of course, the tension this morning about here in India itself, about the government not being as responsive to local cities and local decision-making, and the question of, well, then, who will decide, given that legislatures and governments are often dominated by non-urban interests, as is often also the case in the United States. So this question of who decides and what role, I think, does the third sector, which is not monolithic, but private sector, foundations, others play in pushing for systemic change. And I think along those lines, there are a few things we can pick up on that I think we want to explore in this panel. One, of course, is the question that's always there when we talk about public-private partnerships, which is how much, where is the balance between privatization of benefit and socialization of risk? I mean, it's the classic debate that goes on, just like the debate of top-down versus bottom-up. But I mean, Gerald Frug talked a lot about it. Ed Glaeser talked about it, his description of early systems of infrastructure. But when we think about public-private partnerships, we have to ask that question of where is risk being shifted, who is benefiting, who is this for, and is this really what the role of the private sector should be doing or what government should be doing? So we want to understand really critically some of that perspective. Secondly, the whole role of innovation. Ed Glaeser talked this morning about cities need government and they require experimentation. How does one do that? If cities can't lay a pipe, how can they manage public-private participation, in a sort of provocative statement? But what does it mean? Cities do need experimentation, and what the role, I think we'll hear presentations about the ways that foundations and others, and private sector as well, can push on experimentation in government. What's the role of inclusion, the responsibility of inclusion in that? Is it just about making a better government? Or what about the inclusive nature we've been talking about? Is it to really open up government? Open data, big data, the things we hear about, what Adam talked about this morning in the panel before this. How can we also, what role does this sectors play in kind of opening up this debate? I think Neil in his discussion talked, it was very interesting, opens up the connection between the global network and local urbanism that the sectors can play, which is this whole larger connectivity between how a city positions itself and into the larger global network, and actually pushing for this notion of extended urbanism, that maybe a city in and of itself can't think that way, or a system can't think that way because of how they're bound administratively or geographically. I think that's another issue to put on the table. So I think these are just different lenses through which I think we can sort of frame the discussion. That's a lot, I understand, to try to take in, but in terms of the themes of today and what we're now hearing in our last panel, I think, some perspective on what we're trying to get at in what this role of this sector is in pushing us towards different levels of government, governance, and critically, who designs the system, how are we designing it, and who are we designing it for? And with that, I'll turn to my colleague for some opening comments, then we'll go to the presentation.
Thanks, Randy. No, I won't take too much time of the opening comments. I think most of you have been quite well briefed during the course of the day about, as Neil said in the last lecture, what the limits of local government are. And consequently, whenever innovation comes into the story, which is what this sector presumably brings to the table, the engagement with such innovation, the quote-unquote right to experiment, does the city have the right to experiment? And if it doesn't, how do you guys get your foot in the door? So I think we should start. Arun, you all have your biographies. If you want to learn more about Arun, all you have to do is turn the pages, and you learn a lot more about him as the presentation moves on.
You know, I've been asked to speak on public-private partnership, and I'm not a professor, I'm a practitioner, and I'm going to speak from my experience. You know, public-private partnership is not as new as most people think. You'll be surprised to see this slide. In 1875, there was a public-private partnership in India on the Indian Railways. We go back that long. Today's India, if you just take the infrastructure sector, the government of India is going to spend $1 trillion in the next 5 years. And we all know what the deficit situation with the government is, and it cannot happen without private partnership. In the previous plan, we have a 5-year plan system here. In the previous plan, about 1/3 came from PPP. In the next plan, they're planning to get 50% coming from PPP. That means $500 billion worth of projects will be done through public-private partnership. What are the imperatives? You know, I think shared ownership has a very different meaning here. You know, when we conventionally do joint ventures between two companies, it's owning the shares of the company. Here, the ownership has both sides of the balance sheet. To me, the most important part is what do the two partners bring together, and I'm going to come to that. But you have to not only share the ownership. If you look around the history of which are the projects which have succeeded or not succeeded, I think one thing which was missing in the projects which did not succeed was sharing of the risks. So it's not only what each partner is going to bring. To give you an example, land acquisition is a very big risk in this country. And if the land acquisition risks are not specified who's going to share it, the project will not happen. There has to be a mutual trust. And that is why the community participation is equally important. And that's why I say that the PPP has to move from PPP to PPPC. Because if community will not bring the money, but community brings lots of other things. And unless you have the community buying into the mutual trust, you've read in newspapers how various projects did not take off. And of course, if it is in the PPP mode, it has to be financially viable, even if the returns are not what commercially you look for, because otherwise the project will one day come to a standstill. What's the government's role? I think the government's role primarily is to bring a sharp focus. They must know what they're looking for, both for the community, for the state, but more important, what they're looking for from a partner. And I'm going to give a couple of examples on how this succeeded. Just bear with me out for 2 minutes. And it's very easy to have, those of you from India know various states have various programs and they say we signed so many $1 billion worth of projects, but the government must walk the talk after that. What do private sectors bring? what happens, but the difference between a successful and an unsuccessful project is upfront coming up and making sensible commitments. We tend, as human beings, we try to overpromise, and all the problems later on come from that. The one thing that I learned in my experience is that besides lots of other things, you need to bring patient capital in a PPP project, because PPP projects do not always have do not always meet the timelines which in private sector we are used to making, because there are imperatives that you have to deal with. They get delayed, and if you don't have what I call patient capital, long-term capital, things will not happen. And under promise and over deliver. You will have the community with you, you'll have the media with you, you'll have the government with you. Do not over promise to get a contract and then have problems later on. What's our story? The first PPP project I did was a water project, and including my friends in World Bank, we didn't get World Bank funding for this, thought a public-private partnership in water sector will not work. Why it will not work? Because water is politically too sensitive a subject. It is hugely subsidized by the government. I can lay a bet that none of my Indian friends in this room know what they pay for water at home, because it's so insignificant that they don't know what they pay for water. It is grossly subsidized, hugely subsidized. And it took us 7 years to get a financial close for that project. In this project, the government gave us a concession to bring 185 million liters of water from 60 kilometers from an industrial town. It's 2 minutes? Okay.
No, you're fine.
Okay. What made it succeed? One smart thing we did, this was a water supply to an industrial town. Tirupur is the largest exporter of knitwear in the world. All your t-shirts, whether you buy it on Bond Street or on Fifth Avenue, are made in Tirupur. And so we brought Tirupur Exporters Association as a minority partner. We gave them 5% equity. We brought them on board. We bought them on the board of the company. We brought them on equity. The second thing we did was, of course, I won't take credit for the designing of the scheme, because there was an industrial sector and there was a private sector, the municipal sector. We could cross-subsidize the domestic water supply from the industrial water supply. So we charged market rates to the industrial water supply, and we supplied water to the municipality at 5 rupees a kiloliter, whereas our cost was 37. But the industry was paying 40, so it cross-subsidized, and we were able to break even. The third thing, which was the biggest challenge, because the industry prior to this was used to pumping groundwater and not paying for it. And they were pumping wastewater back to the ground, so the water table was going down, and the quality of water was so bad that it was killing crops and making people sick around that area. And this could not have been done without the support of the government. We had huge resistance from private water tanker operators who would have gone out of business, or who went out of business the moment we came into it. Now, a project like this, neither the government couldn't have done it because it needed $200 million and they did not have the resources. And we could not have done it without the government, because we needed the support on that side. The other project, and this is some of the pictures of this, we are very proud of the fact that the global leakage of water, both physical and commercial, across the world, in the best of the economies is 12%, and we are working at close to 5%. In 1 year, we had a little problem. That's why the average from the beginning till today is 7, but we are still 5% below global average of developed countries. This is a very interesting project. This is while we are talking of smart cities today, we built a city 12 years ago in Chennai and then one in Jaipur. I just got a message from one of my colleagues that JCB put up the world's largest manufacturing plant in Jaipur, inaugurated it today, and the Chief Minister gave a story herself of how this happened. She said she spoke to one of the IT giants of this country and said, I want to bring IT into my state. And that gentleman told him, Vasundhara, you stay with tourism and handicrafts because Jaipur will not do IT. And they looked at us and looked at what we had done in Chennai. And she was telling that on the first day of the groundbreaking, both Infosys and Wipro signed the contract. How did it happen? These are some of the pictures of project. How did it succeed? It succeeded on one factor. We were doing it around the same time when in Eastern India, one of the largest automobile companies and one of the most respected groups in the country was trying to do land acquisition, and we were doing land acquisition. That project didn't happen, it happened here. One simple thing. While the government was willing to give me land at government controlled prices, I decided to give 25% of developed land back to the individual farmers. Now, the 25% of developed land is worth 10 times of what the fallow land works. So he saw something happening in it. Friends, in conclusion, since I've been showed the card, I think this is the way of the future. What you have to do is that you have to take community with it, substitute PPP with PPPC, just make sure, don't lose sight of what it was. Money should be secondary, objective of getting the plant right should be first. Engage all stakeholders, and you need a lot of patience and perseverance. I had beautiful hair when I got into PPP.
Right, Nanda. Pleasure. I heard something at the beginning which said something like the vision needs to come from the government. I'm not sure I sort of agree with that statement after you finish that presentation. But yes, Michael.
So my name is Michael Berkowitz. I'm going to talk to you about 100 resilient cities. It's, to use the framing of Neil's talk, it's a local regulatory experiment across 100 cities and 6 continents globally. So it's, it definitely is absolutely an experiment. 100 Resilient Cities is the Rockefeller Foundation's commitment to build, $100 million commitment to build urban resilience worldwide. Let me just talk about what our working definition of what urban resilience is. It's the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city to survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. And so maybe just to pause there, we have a very broad definition of what resilience is. Most people come into this idea of resilience with the acute events, the disasters in mind. And certainly we want to continue to think about them and plan for them and understand them. So we're talking both about weather events and climate change events like storms, flooding, earthquakes, terrorism, industrial accidents. But we're also thinking about more pervasive impacts on cities, these chronic stresses. So thinking about things like food, water, and energy shortage, thinking about macroeconomic conditions changing, thinking about very, very high and debilitating levels of crime and violence. All of those things also have the ability to bring a city to its knees. And so when we think about resilience, we think about it in that broad starting place. Another thing I should mention here is that when I talk about a city, I'm not talking about municipal government largely. I'm talking about the entire ecosystem that makes a city as we've been describing it. So all of the things I talk about when I talk about urban resilience, city resilience, I'm talking about that broader ecosystem here. And we also have a very broad view of what makes a city, that whole ecosystem, what makes it resilient. And so it's meeting basic needs. So this question about toilets, the number of toilets. I think that's a very good indicator of how resilient a city is in some senses. It's about emergency services and public health, but it's also about cohesive communities. It's about the fair and equitable distribution of law and justice. It's about infrastructure, as I'm sure, which is a place that many people think about when they think about resilience, but not just built infrastructure, but also the natural environment. We see a city like Bangalore that had 1,600 lakes at one point, now has 400, and it's a city that floods when it rains and runs out of water when it's dry. So, it's about how well we take care of our infrastructure, both natural and built. And finally, it's about good governance and management. All of those things make a city more resilient. And so the theory of change, the problem statement for 100 resilient cities is twofold. One is that cities are complex ecosystems with a number of different stakeholders. I don't think I need to make that point anymore today. It's been made many, many times. The second is that market solutions, cities don't leverage solutions available to them. They too often miss them for one reason or another. They reinvent them. They don't leverage them. They think only something that was created in the Indian context will work in the Indian context. Not only something that we invented in New York will work in New York. We hear that everywhere we go. And so what we're trying to do is solve for those two problems. And we're going to choose 100 cities over the next 3 years and provide them 4 kinds of support. The first is funding to hire a chief resilience officer, a senior person, and this is where municipal government does come in. In municipal government, the CRO to the CEO, whether that's the mayor, the commissioner, or the governor, to work across the sectors and the silos, to advocate and to push this resilience agenda. And second is support to develop a resilience strategy, a rigorous process. Think about it over something like 6 to 9 months to look at what the risks and the hazards are, what the city is already doing and what its strengths and weaknesses are, and what should be priorities and initiatives to support those priorities. The third level of support is this access to a platform of services and resources. This is tie up with partners, funders, with technologists, big data analytics, with NGOs, academic institutions, people who want to work in cities so that cities can more effectively leverage the stuff that's out there. We've had a number of conversations with cities, for instance, with funders, for instance, who say, when you identify your issues, whether those are transportation, health, governance, place-based development, and so on, when you identify those things, let us come in on the back of what you're doing and fund those things. Let us bring those solutions to cities in a way that's more efficient. And so this platform of services is trying to help do that. And finally, membership into a peer-to-peer network so they can share best practice amongst themselves and really leverage what their successes and failures and learnings are. And so you see that the first two try to address this first problem, that cities are complex ecosystems, and the second two try to scale market solutions more effectively. Just a little bit of where we are sort of administratively. We've run a challenge over 2 years. We've had over 700 applications. We selected 32 cities in 2013, and we're about to announce the next 33 cities in December. Those are where our Wave 1 cities, but because that map doesn't look so good, I will just talk about them here. You can see only one Indian city, Surat, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But we're seeing, even though there's this amazing diversity, big cities like Rio and Mexico City, small cities like Ramallah in Palestine, Byblos, and middle-sized Tier 2 cities like Surat, for instance, you can see that we're seeing already a host of common issues that these cities are dealing with and struggling with in ways that they're leveraging each other to provide solutions. So we got those chief resilience officers, our first 25 chief resilience officers together last week. And we did a number of things, but one of the things we sort of pushed them to think about some of the big trends that we're seeing in resilience. And I'll share 3 of them with you now because I think they relate to what we're talking about in terms of governance and partnerships. The first is that we've heard around infrastructure. The stat we used was $57 trillion in infrastructure through 2030. Whether it's what Anshu said in terms of the building of the infrastructure the size of Chicago every year, just in India, we know that cities are going to build and build a lot. And hopefully they don't build like this picture, frankly, right? We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to incorporate resilient design into cities to do things better. Hank Ovink's going to talk to you tomorrow about Rebuild by Design, a design competition that looked to build on and leverage interesting thinking and resilient design. And just one example is this project called the Big U, where New York was looking for a seawall to protect itself against flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise. And that can be a pretty boring and frankly, it may be even a destructive kind of thing if you build it the wrong way. But if you start to think about what else it could be in terms of a mix of green and gray infrastructure, community spaces, to build community cohesion, art projects to bolster the cultural scene, exercise areas to make Americans a little less fat if that's possible. All of those things make the city stronger and more resilient. And so we as a community, and this was a plea to our chief resilience officers, we can really, if we really work this, we can make a real impact. The second big trend is that we think inequity and social cohesion is going to define the resilience agenda going forward. This seems like it's the big differentiator between cities that can handle a shock like the police making a mistake and shooting the wrong person, an earthquake, a terrorist attack, a hurricane, flooding, whatever. Cities that have cohesive communities where neighbors check on neighbors, where there's trust amongst the different groups. Frankly, like we saw in the visit to the slum yesterday, those kind of communities can weather those shocks. And so this is going to be a major issue for resilience thinkers going forward. The third is that, and this goes to what we've been talking about all day, and I had this slide, this is what I was talking to my CROs about last week, that these challenges transcend jurisdictions, borders, and boundaries. And so I have a slightly different take on this, that yes, we need to make the municipality stronger, we need to do it certainly in India and probably many other places around the world, but we are still, no matter how strong you make the municipality, you are still going to have to work in coalitions and with informal power. It's always going to be that way, and so I think that's going to be one of the real issues. Maybe just to end on the Surat example. So when you think about a city that's able to rebound and recover and grow in the face of shocks and stresses, think about Surat. It's a city in Gujarat, about 5 million people. It had plague in 1994, and on the back of that, they really overhauled, 30 seconds away, they really overhauled the public health system, did lots of community-based education, taught about cleanliness and new hygienic methods and so on. And in 2006, they had another massive flood where downtown saw 10 feet of water. And so the point of this is that, and Surat kept improving and kept growing and kept learning from it. And that I think is the point, is that we're going to have shocks and stresses, setbacks and not, but the real key is to keep learning from it, that resilience is a process and not a product. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of interesting stuff there. So,
all right, my name is Jim Anderson. I lead the government innovation programs at Bloomberg Philanthropies. And I was asked to share a little bit about some of our efforts to build the capacity of local government leaders to innovate. Cities need to get a lot better at innovating policy, innovating around governance, innovating around basic nuts and bolts operational issues. And there's clearly an innovation skills and resources gap in city halls. Cities struggle to clearly scope out the challenges that they're trying to address. They struggle to understand what's working in other places and what models might be relevant in their local context. They struggle to generate, test, and scale up new solutions. They have a hard time engaging citizens and other partners to think about problem solving in a new way. And they really struggle to carve out space for risk-taking, as came up in the introduction to this section. So at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we think that boosting the capacity of local governments to innovate makes a lot of sense. And we're focused on it on a couple of different ways. We're talking a lot about the need for local governments to aspire towards continuous innovation. So here's what that means. That's about the relentless pursuit of better solutions for citizens. It's a way of working, a set of priorities and values that are reinforced by leadership and become known and embraced within the organization. It's about creating a culture and an ongoing capacity to really find the next best opportunity to generate new solutions, to come up with better ideas, and to bring them to life. We're absolutely talking about proactive government and proactive city halls, again, as was talked about earlier this morning. Now, most of our experience to date has been in North America. We're increasingly working in European and South American cities, and as we've canvassed these city halls and we've identified a set of attributes that are commonly in place when you see a lot of innovation, here are a few of them. First and foremost is sort of a commitment of the leader to use their moral authority, data, their experiences from elsewhere to say we can do better, to open eyes of citizens and bureaucrats to the fact of substandard business as usual. Someone said earlier that we need to bring a sense of urgency to management, and that's really the job of local leaders and the elected officials. The importance of data throughout the innovation process is critical, from diagnosing problems to testing solutions to measuring impact and then communicating that story to the public, really important to moving innovation forward. Flat beats vertical. Our bureaucracies are typically organized in silos. Our funding streams reinforce those silos. Most innovative city halls are finding ways to work on a horizontal basis, oftentimes in cross-agency sort of heavyweight teams that are advancing these initiatives. Curiosity versus creativity. You know, a lot of times you see city halls start immediately with, recreating the wheel. I think one of the themes you'll hear from Michael and from the C40 is the importance of looking elsewhere and figuring out what is working and will those models work in our context. Planning to act and long-distance sprinting, I hate these titles. They sort of mean nothing, but they come from sort of new business management techniques. So this is really, to sort of fight against the tendency in government to hide in a corner and plan and plan and plan for that perfect, big, new program. And really instead, let's iterate, let's start small, let's use that minimum viable product, let's see how it works, let's learn, adapt, and let's grow from there. And this long-distance sprinting idea is a really important one because, going after any sort of intractable issue is going to take a lot of time, a lot of persistence, and a commitment over a period of time. So how do you keep momentum in that context? How do you, manage for quick wins and sort of through repeated cycles of development, sort of keep your team on track and moving down the field? Finally, and to the topic of this particular panel discussion, partnerships. How do we think much differently, more broadly about engaging citizens, civil society, and other partners in solving problems in partnership with government? The reality is that most city halls want to do this better. They don't have tools, resources, the skills to negotiate effective partnerships, to make a promise for increased citizen engagement, and then really deliver on it over time. So we know cities need support there. There are a couple of, there are cities around the globe that are doing this really well. Mayor Michael Nutter in Philadelphia is pressing a number of different levers to create this continuous innovation and this culture of innovation within Philadelphia City Hall. Mayor Wonsoon Park in Seoul, South Korea is another excellent example of a mayor who's working on a number of different fronts to really create a government that is open to new ideas, that embraces them, and that creates meaningful on-ramps for new ideas to take hold and get traction. Most governments, however, are really at a starting point. And I think one of the big challenges that local governments have is they still don't think about innovation as a process or as a capacity that they can nurture and develop. And that's really important. So sparks are needed, outside resources, expertise, and encouragement, and that's really what we're focused on providing at Bloomberg Philanthropies. I'm going to briefly talk about 2 programs that we use to promote innovation and deepen the capacity of local governments to innovate. The first is the Mayor's Challenge. The Mayor's Challenge is an innovation competition for cities. It encourages city leaders to generate bold new ideas that address urban challenges, improve city life, and that have potential to spread to other cities. The program, we've conducted it twice, in 2013 in the United States, in 2014 took it to Europe. Over 450 cities and a couple thousand municipal innovators have participated in these efforts. The Mayor's Challenge works to promote innovation on 2 levels, broadly and deeply. Broadly, it's about giving hundreds of cities a very compelling set of incentives to pause, to think more radically about new approaches, to engage in a different set of conversations with people in their community, to take risks they might not otherwise take, and to really put on their A game. Going deeply, we invest in the teams behind the top applications, engaging them in a very deep process of innovation over a period of many months. This is about boot camps, individualized coaching, master classes in a wide range of project management and innovation skills. And the goal here is, yes, let's improve the projects that you've submitted to the competition, but let's also give you a set of techniques and tools that you can take home and apply more broadly in your work. The solutions and the ideas that have come out of the Mayor's Challenge exemplify the values that we've been promoting. 95% of the applications in the recent European Mayor's Challenge involved interagency collaboration. 75% relied on outside partnerships. 70% brought in academics in some way, shape, or form. Nearly 50% included very robust citizen engagement strategies. The grand prize winner, Barcelona, in some ways checks all of the boxes. They used a human-centered design process to generate their idea. They're using lean principles as they're thinking about moving into implementation. They have a complicated but very smart partnership with academics, private sector organizations, civil society groups, and citizens to breathe life into this initiative. So very excited to see how that one moves forward. Now I want to turn to the second case study and program that we use to promote innovation capacity in city halls. We've been testing a model. It's called the Innovation Delivery Approach. It's a innovation unit located in city halls. These are small teams reporting directly to the mayor, serving as an in-house innovation consultancy, working with partners in agencies and their partners outside of government to generate bigger, bolder, more ambitious ideas. Specifically, these innovation delivery teams take city hall actors through a sort of 4-step process. The first is really around scoping the problem, using data to understand its size, its scope, its local root causes. The second step involves using cutting-edge idea generation techniques to come up with better, more ambitious proposals and ideas. The third is around implementation and partnership planning, network governance strategies to make sure that the partners you need to implement this program are there with you, aligned around goals at the beginning, and stay with you through to the end. And fourthly, strong performance management, Michael Barber delivery, to make sure you know where you are, if you're on track, if you're not, and using routines to sort of move the ball down the field. The reality is that almost no cities take such a structured approach when they embark on innovation. If you think about that, they're otherwise going quite blindly as they're developing new policies and new programs to try and effectively engage citizens and solve problems in their lives. This program's doing great. We've been in the field for about 3 years. All 5 of the initial U.S. cities are generating some powerful results. I'll give you a couple of examples. In Memphis, the mayor, Wharton, has used the innovation delivery approach to generate a suite of initiatives that have helped reduce commercial vacancy rates in some very distressed neighborhoods by 30% and generated hundreds of small business starts. In New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu has used the innovation delivery approach to help generate a citywide campaign against murder that he attributes to having helped facilitate a near 20% reduction in murder year over year from 2012 to 2013. 2013 had the lowest number of murders in New Orleans that city has seen in 20 years. So we're excited about these initiatives. They're grounded in data, best practices. They're engaging citizens and partners in powerful new ways. They're moving at lightning speed, relatively speaking. And perhaps as importantly, the approaches that they're adopting or that the teams are championing are starting to take root more broadly in City Hall. We're going to be scaling that initiative up to another 20 or so cities in the coming 2 years. I had one more slide, but I'm going to stop there. I got the time, and we'll pick it up in the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. And 3 examples, lots of examples to choose from. We have 4 panelists to respond, 5 minutes each to begin with. And if you can start with Narendra Nair. You've had experience of Bombay first. How do they respond to these structures going forward?
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. We were talking about the partnership, governance and partnership. I want to share with you the example of Mumbai, or Bombay, I call it Mumbai, where we have developed a very effective public-private partnership between the state government and the private sector. Now, why did this happen? Because the city Bombay at one time was a primary city in Indus, but it had been losing its importance over a period of time and deteriorating. So the corporate world got together to see how we could help in bringing the city up to what it used to be at. So that public-private partnership between the state government has led to a very effective communication working with the government and the government of India. But that followed before a study was carried out with McKinsey and Bombay First. And that showed where the city was lacking and what needs to be done. Now, we did a study compared with the world, and Bombay was lacking on several areas, transport, environment, and various areas. And we said, what needs to be done? What are the challenges of the city? Yeah. So we established 2 or 3 very important institutions, where one is the Empowered Committee of the government, which is headed by the Chief Secretary, which is a unique body here. There is not done anywhere else, which meets every month to see what are the challenges of the city and how the government can work together on that. The second more important thing is the Citizen Action Group, which is headed by the Chief Minister, and which also which has got 30 members drawn from cross-sectional society. They meet every 6 months or so to discuss the challenges of the city. Now, when we commenced our journey, this is about some years ago, we were no illusion that our task was going to be easy. But as we progress along, we now see what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. There are many opportunities. What are the biggest challenges? The biggest challenges that we found out in the city was implementation, the lack of implementation. But that again boiled down to one factor only, the governance. The governance pattern was totally inadequate. There are 17 agencies responsible for governing the city or building the city. And some are responsible to the state, some are responsible to the central government, some are responsible to municipal corporation, and there's a total lack of coordination between all these agencies here. And we said, look, you need to have somebody accountable for the city. Now, we talk about an elected mayor, that is obviously the ideal solution, but that's not going to happen. So we are now suggesting there could perhaps be a chief executive or somebody responsible for one person accountable for the city. So these are some of the challenges we have mentioned there. Also the planning. The planning process was totally inadequate. So Bombay is the only city, as far as I know, in India, which we have done a concept plan, a vision document with an international consultant to see where Mumbai needs to be, or metropolitan region needs to be in 50 years' time. When we look at the challenges of Bombay, we have to look at the metropolitan region. Now, Bombay is only a small island city, but we look at metropolitan, which is 10 times the size. What are the challenges of the metropolitan city? They've got no governance pattern at all. There are about 9 municipal corporations in the metropolitan region, with several municipal councils, several Zilla Prashad, and there is nobody governing, nobody responsible, a single point responsible for what happens in that area. So what we need is a proper whether you call it a mayor or call it a commissioner, or for the metropolitan area, not only the city area. And I think you're showing me the time, but let me say my point is that we should not look at public-private partnership. Public-private partnership is between private sector, the public partnership, but we should also involve politicians into this PPP model, which could perhaps be solve a lot of problems that we've been talking about today could perhaps be solved on that basis. Before I conclude, I'll just sort of say one point that we have been trying to advise our authorities in the government, and what really John Kennedy said almost 60 years ago, that we neglect our cities to our peril. For neglecting them, we neglect the nation. So the cities are important, and the governance is, I think, the most important thing that the cities need to be done, and that's the subject of the conversation today, which I hope will lead to something. And one point may I also just make before I make, as for the authority, because we had a very good discussion the whole day today. But I don't see many people who are really concerned about this in the government or in the municipal corporation who are here today, who can get the message about, who can see how they're going to change now. But I think maybe we should send a message that these sort of conferences can only be helpful and useful if they should be also here to listen to what the other world is doing, and that could be helpful. Thank you.
Andy, you wanted to say something?
But I just want to pick up on one thing very quickly and briefly, so we'll have a longer discussion. But I think, Arun, you had said earlier something PPPC, right? And I'm curious, Nander, when you were doing the plan for Bombay First, how do you define the C? And also, Arun, how did you define, what would you say the C is? And how do you bring them into a process when you're initiating something from outside government, and if government isn't necessarily an elected government, so already it's, as we've heard from this morning, discussion of governance of who represents, the broader community and which community. How does one define that coming in from the outside as the private sector, to private sector individuals trying to push change and push an agenda, and you don't have a government that's necessarily maybe not as inclusive or as concerned about what the broader community. How do you push that, or how did you do that? And I guess James and Michael, I'm curious also in your plans when you go in with the different entities, how do you bring the C into your process, or how do you ensure that who is the C and how are they included? And that's a big question. Maybe we can do it very quickly and we'll hit on it in a little more discussion. But how do we bring that sense of inclusion into this discussion?
Yeah. Like in industry, we have changed the definition of stakeholders in the last 20 years. If 20 years ago you talked to somebody, he would say stakeholders were shareholders. And then you came to employees, and now you take the stakeholders as the community at large. There's no one-size-fits-all, but in any public-private partnership, the community has 3 interests. They are primarily the user of the facility, whether it is electricity, water, roads, whatever it is. They have a stake. There may be things like resources which may be controlled by the community. And ultimately, the community in some form or the other pays for it. And if you do not, there was 10 years ago, if you talk to policymakers, they would have said we should have a regulatory authority, and that's why you saw plethora of regulatory authorities come up in every space. But if you look around, if you bring the community into right from the beginning of the project, and I give you an example, in India, land acquisition is the most painful process. Now, there are 2 ways you can do land acquisition. You can do forcible land acquisition to the government, or you go back and sit with the community and work out what works for both of you. Even when you talk of user charges, ultimately when you take the user charges, also the community has to be brought on force.
So we try to bring in the corporate sector. in our model, we sort of the corporate sector, which is a very powerful corporate sector in Bombay. So we got together, we went to the government and said, the city is deteriorating. We want to work with that. We will bring to funds, we bring to our technical resources, we bring to support it. But we will only come in if we have a commitment from the government. In fact, I can go back when we had a meeting with the then chief minister, I said, the city is deteriorating and the quality of life is going down. Do you know what needs to be done? He said, yes, but we don't know what we should do. So I said, with the corporate sector who were with me, and they said, fine, we will come and support you. But provided we have some assurance that you will listen to what we were saying. Because we didn't want to prepare a report study by McKinsey and Bombay First sitting in the 10th floor, 21st floor air-conditioned office. So we wanted to work with the government, with the authority stakeholders to prepare a report. They were part of it. The moment the report was submitted to the then chief minister, he immediately reacted to it. Several institutions were set up. These institutions are only in Bombay, they're working, they're nowhere else. And where the citizens, the corporate world sit together and they listen to challenge. Let me also say that the government officials, by and large, have been very responsive to what we say. They're responsive to, they need to that. But the system just doesn't move. System doesn't make it work. And that's where that, I think, needs to be done, is put system right. And that comes.
I think the story is a great illustration of what Neil was talking about earlier. You don't really have an urban government. You have a.
Sorry?
I said Bombay really doesn't have an urban government. There's a lot of governments in Bombay. Yeah. You mentioned 17 of them, at least agencies. And sort of getting that stuff to work together across that regional space that you spoke about is, I think, a pretty, we'll have a nice case study for Neil to chew over if he gets through in that story.
But I think if I say, according to the World Bank, when they've been working with us, they said this is the only public-private partnership for the regeneration city anywhere in the world which is working successfully. And the Urban Development Ministry is
if I can just call on Ashwin. We had the mention of the lakes of Bangalore from 1600 to 400. I don't know whether you agree with it, but there's a whole bunch of other things.
We'll get to the lakes. As you know, for about 10 or 12 years, I used to be a climate scientist. Until about 1995, climate models did not include the Arctic or the Antarctic. And they would sort of go on about making great predictions of what's going to happen to the whole world, and they were leaving out about 35 to 40 degrees of latitude in their models. And not only were they leaving out 35 to 40 degrees of latitude, these were the most important 35 to 40 degrees of latitude. A lot of conversations like this remind me of that. We talk about state governments and national governments and city governments, and we don't talk about citizens. And each one of them sort of will say, yeah, we're talking to the citizens too. They're kind of there, like the polar regions, but it's kind of, for the moment, extremely hot to go there, and we sort of will stay away from that. I'm going to say 6 really short things, and I won't take more than 30, 40 seconds in each one of them. We need to remember that government is a creation of citizens, and it's not the other way around. We tend to behave in most democracy as though government is something that got created in either 1774 or 1947, and that today's citizens have no opportunity to rethink and recreate government. That's not necessarily true. Citizens ought to have, and do in fact have, the continuous right and the opportunity to rethink government and to reset the basis in which government is done on an ongoing basis. Everybody sort of by rote knows this story of the people, for the people, and by the people. And we sort of go through our lives as though they all mean the same thing. If they all mean the same thing, there would be no need to call them out independently. And I sort of want to ask specifically, what does by the people mean? And to my reading of a phrase like that, by the people means that there are certain things that we expect governments to do, which in fact citizens themselves ought to be able, empowered, and able to pull off in some way. And this sort of brings us to the city. We've talked about challenges of diversity, of complexity, contestation, confrontation, even somebody used that word. And I think all of these things are going to continue in every city in the world in an ongoing way. But what they point to is that the solution to these challenges can't be that we identify what works technically or managerially and try to scale them. Instead, we work on a model that increases the number of problem-solving people. right? We need to again and again ask ourselves, if we are intervening in a city in a way that we think is positive, is that intervention going to increase the number of problem-solving people? And the largest pool from which to identify the potential number of problem-solving people is ordinary citizens. The fourth thing, I know it's sort of been fashionable all day to talk about Bangalore, but you know, the last time I looked, we were still getting 1,000 people a day coming into the city. There's something going on in Bangalore, and if you took an opinion poll in this room of which cities you think had the most promise in terms of being able to reform all of the urban problems that we have in this country, I'm sure we'd do pretty well in a poll like that. And there's a reason for that, because ordinary people in Bangalore have much more traction in the governance and the shaping of things on the ground than in most other parts of the country. I personally, as you know, Partho, have been involved in bus reforms, traffic digitization, lake revival, garbage management, smart cities, city planning, all sorts of things. And I am an astronomer and a climate scientist. So it's not very difficult, if you wanted to, for people to become involved in these things. Then comes the question, if we were to trust citizens to self-organize for city management and city governance, would that turn into something that is for the middle classes and the rich only? And would that leave out the poor? I think it's a ridiculous question. The idea, and every time somebody says there's a risk in that, I usually ask them back, are you the kind of person that if this choice was given to you, you would care only about the middle class and the poor and the rich? And they would immediately say, not me, but there are so many other people in the city who wouldn't care about anything other than the middle class. I think it's extraordinarily dangerous to embrace the idea that rich people or middle class people or educated people do not care about the poor or will not care about the poor. In fact, democracy depends on a basic premise that such people do care about the poor and act in their interests. And there's lots of evidence. The public school system was not set up by the poor. The universal healthcare system was not set up by the poor. People do care about the poor. And we need to actually embrace and promote that. And this goes back to what Neil was saying in his presentation. He sort of talked about the limits of what we can pull off in the urban governance space. I would argue that we haven't even begun to explore what is possible by working with citizens, and we're already talking about the limits. I think we should be talking about what citizens can do, not what can't be done from the urban governance space. And from that perspective, I would encourage international institutions, multilateral institutions that engage with city halls and state governments and even corporate bodies that engage with others to essentially to ask the question, can we promote the publicly managed city? Can we see ordinary citizens as managers of the city, as planners of the city? And if we were to sort of factor in these northern latitudes and the southern latitudes in our models of how the city should change, how would our work be differently shaped by that? I think that's the essence of democracy, to imagine what is possible from within and not have to think about what limitations are in the existing structures.
The one thing that Ashwin forgot to tell you he was that he is, if I'm not wrong, now a politician. And you have a pretty good idea of why he is. So moving from climate science, it's only natural that one moves to Sanjay, the C40.
Thank you, Partha.
5 minutes. If you can engage with the presentation, that'd be wonderful, but sure. The floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. I mean, looking at it from a C40's perspective, I mean, we are engaging the 69 biggest cities in the world. I mean, the goal was 40 cities, but we've actually got 69 cities to be members now. But what we're seeing is across the, I mean, I manage the South and West Asia region, but we have other regions that are expanding, some regions that are quite mature, the North American, Europe region. But what we're seeing is there is a fundamental challenge about governance, even in developed countries like New York City. I mean, there are areas that the mayor cannot control because it either belongs to the state or the federal government. But translating those challenges to cities in the developing countries, India in particular, focus, cities like Chennai, Bangalore, Dhaka, and Amman, I bring these 4 cities into focus because they are in some ways similarly set up. They've all had colonial rule in their recent past. Chennai has an elected mayor, Bangalore similar in size, but of course a lot younger than the city of Chennai. They don't have an elected mayor, but there is a fundamental similarity of how the governance challenges actually play out in each of these cities. And Dhaka, for example, their mayors change every 6 months because that's the kind of rollover rate that the city is experiencing. And the only constant person over there is actually the junior executive engineer. He is there more permanent than the administrators or the mayors. So there is a problem of continuity, but also a question of making sure that the outcomes are achieved on the ground. So a couple of things that I want to bring to focus. One is the role of civil society, and I think Ashwin brought up a great point about scaling success is actually scaling the problem solver. The number of people who can solve problems outside of government is critically, it's a critical mass that needs to be developed. Bangalore is a great example. We're also seeing the civil society becoming quite active in cities like Chennai. Mumbai first is another great example. And I think that augments the government's ability, because the government currently is only firefighting. They're not doing the thinking. And the civil society in some ways, and organizations like the 100RC, the World Resources Institute, Embark, ITDP, they can actually function as the knowledge partners for the government, because the government has other priorities. Sometimes they're political, most of the times they are, but that's the augmentation and the acceleration of problem solving that needs to be done within cities. A good case and example is what's happening in Bangalore. I'm also from Bangalore, so I might have a biased opinion, but there is a program known as BCLIP, which stands for Bangalore City Leadership Incubation Program, Bangalore Civic. So what it's doing is, through civil society, they're actually training all the sitting corporators who are people elected from the different 200 wards of the city in budget management, in transparency, in participatory planning, integrated planning. This has never been given to them. But in addition to training existing corporators, they're also training people who are aspiring to be corporators. So you're actually training the next generation of elected representatives who will stand for office at the level of the city municipal corporation. So that level of civil society involvement in basically investing in the future of the city by investing in its community. And what the BCLIP is actually doing is, it has put in focus the constitutional role that the corporator has to play in terms of the responsibility and accountability, because they go hand in hand. Another example is the Neighborhood Improvement Partnership. This is basically taking an entire city ward that is represented by the corporator and saying, what is it that you have to do at a technical level to bring in infrastructure, water, solid waste management, planning, land use change, air quality monitoring, open spaces, green cover, footpaths, mode shares in transport. So these are all, at some ways, the smallest scale of planning, but it also coincides with the smallest scale of government. And there has to be that level of capacity building that needs to come in at the city level. And 2 minutes? Thank you. I think I'll finish in that. The other thing that is quite interesting is we're beginning to see within C40 that cities are now taking the lead, because they realize that problem solving actually happens at that level. At the level of the ward, at the level of projects, because people understand that there are outcomes and you can link outcomes to election cycles. There's accountability built in as a result of that. And one case and example is the city of Bangalore. We've had a severe solid waste management problem. Just to give you some numbers, about 4,500 tons of solid waste is dumped in landfills every day. And the city realized after some point that it cannot do it. And so what has happened is the forging of alliances outside of government. In some ways, the civil society took the government to court and said, you are not discharging your constitutional responsibility of delivering services. And this is one way that the government is held accountable. At the same time, it just did not challenge the city, but it also said, here is a solution that you can follow. So you're not being critical, but you're also proposing a solution. And one of them is this. Now, this is a recent kind of forging of alliance. The city of Bangalore has now entered into an agreement with the city of Yokohama, which has really done some fantastic work in solid waste. City of Bangalore, City of Yokohama, funding from JICA, the Japanese International Aid Agency, and C40. So all the four have come together and said, this is how you bring both the technology as well as the process roadmap. How do you do the contracting? How do you do the supervision, the monitoring, the governance system that has to function within? And so the last point that might be of interest to Neil is, and this is actually something that I picked up from your presentation, Michael, is I think cities in India are complex, but they're informally organized. The urbanization is so informal. You cannot have a structured approach to the urbanization of a country that is quite informal, and therefore your land use planning frameworks don't work. Your economic models don't work. So how do you look at organizing the informal character in the urbanization pattern of cities? And I think this is the last point, which is I think the government also needs to re-envision the role that it plays, from being a service provider to being an enabler of services. And this is the critical shift that needs to happen within how the government sees its role, with the augmentation and the acceleration that comes in from civil society, and the government starts to play a very different role, even though the power devolution, the devolution of power has not happened. But I think it needs to fundamentally see how the role, it needs to be transitioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Finally, Sanjeev. Sanjeev dabbles in history. Dabbles is perhaps the wrong way of putting it. But, and he does much else besides. So how do you respond to this whole idea of cities without government, cities without formality, all of them essentially trying to stumble around, finding new ways of engaging with public problems?
Okay. What I would like to say is that while cities themselves are organic creatures, okay, is that, okay. Well, the way I would respond to it is by saying that while cities are complex adaptive systems, governing them does not have to be somehow an organic process in the way, you're somehow expecting visions to emerge out of a churn from the citizens upward. My view is that if we are thinking about who designs the city, who decides, maybe you can have a public-private partnership, but to what end? Who decides about whether to experiment, what to experiment about? All of this ultimately comes down to leadership and vision. And while in a democracy, people vote between different visions put up by different political leaders or whatever, at least for me, do not think they actually formulate the vision. They choose between different visions at best. So consequently, what is important is what these visions are and debating those visions. I don't know if I'm making sense, but let's take, for example, in the current context, Prime Minister Modi, at least at the national level, has come up with a vision of 100 smart cities. Now, one can like it or dislike it. But the fact is, for the first time, instead of looking at urbanization as some sort of a bad thing, we have a Prime Minister who has said that we're going to actually build 100 smart cities. Now, I think the sensible thing to do is to debate what this vision should be. I don't think it's set in stone. It is evolving, but that is what we need to debate, rather than endlessly go on about somehow hoping that this vision will appear from below. We can later on vote or unvote it, vote against or for it. Now, I think in the context of this 100 smart cities, I think the specific problem I have with the vision, as it stands today, is that it is thought about exclusively in technological terms and hardware terms, that somehow faster bullet trains, sensors, and big data is what it's about. But in fact, smartness of cities has got to be about a lot more other things. It's got to be, for example, if you're going to build 100 smart cities, well, they're not being built in a vacuum. We've been building cities here for 5,000, 6,000 years. So most of these smart cities would actually be extensions of existing cities. How do we then make a partnership with the historical context of these cities as we expand them? How much do we preserve? How much we don't preserve? How do we create a partnership with the cultural context in which these cities exist. So when I see, for example, vision documents or planners come up with these lovely design civil engineering solutions, the fact of the matter is, where is the Ram Leela ground? You know, Indians are a religious people. Where are they going to have the Durga Puja or the Muharram? That is almost not put there. Instead, what you have is a lovely design of something resembling New York Central Park. Who cares? We don't want that. We want to actually have a Ram Leela. But we never see that in the design. Same thing happens with the environmental context. You'll see all these designs will have these strange wispy trees, all of them. The fact of the matter is, those strange wispy trees don't grow in India. Where is my banyan tree? So the point is, when you're talking about partnerships, I think it's about visions, and those visions themselves should have partnership with other things. It has to do with the historical context, the cultural and social context. It has to have a partnership with the environmental context in which we are living. And finally, I want to make a big deal out of this. I'm making a big deal out of this because about 60 years ago, we had attempted to build a few new cities. And when those cities were built by a gentleman called Le Corbusier, we made a real disaster of it. In fact, one of the reasons many of India's cities are dysfunctional today is a direct result of his influence. As a result, all the functioning cities in India today are cities which were built before we became independent. Independent India has not been able to create one single decent functioning city. And it's because of this. Because when we decided to bring in Le Corbusier to build these new cities, what he did is he built Chandigarh and Durgapur and these kinds of cities, which were outside, in fact, were deliberately outside of the social, historical, and environmental context. And I think that is the partnership that we need to build, and these visions that we vote for and against must incorporate these partnerships. But again, I want to emphasize that this cannot be about somehow expecting, some community interaction to throw up these visions. That will not happen. Leadership is a top-down activity. That's how it is. And as a democracy, we will choose our leader, but we expect that leader to lead. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Corbusier reminds me, Charles Jeanneret's name. So when he went back to Passage, which is one of his famous housing projects in France, about 20 years after Passage was built, he found significant changes to what had happened to it. So the gentleman who was accompanying him asked him, what do you think? You built something and look at what people have done to it. And Corbusier turns to this guy and says, it's life which is right and the planner who is wrong. So Corbusier himself was not as attached to the physicality of his design as his acolytes have tended to be. And that, I think, is a difference between a visionary and perhaps an implementer. But let me get back to Ashwini. It's because Sanjeev says, this community stuff really doesn't work. Too many people, too many voices, too much informality. Jim doesn't know who to engage with. You can't find your nice leadership. You don't know where you're going to put your chief resilience officer. So how the hell is this going to work?
First off, I didn't say it was easy. But these are complex problems. But I guarantee that it's sort of like education, right? The popular saying that if you think getting an education is hard, try going through life without it. And I think it's the same thing, that while putting cities together in this way that leverages what people actually want and sort of anticipates and builds for what they want, it is difficult. But doing it any other way is actually even more difficult. It's not any more likely to get to the outcome simply because it's easier. That's number one. Second thing, and I would say, I mean, definitely based on my own experiences, that it's possible to build coalitions of people who intervene in public problem solving and push cities towards various outcomes, and in the process build both political capital and intellectual capital and other kinds of social capital needed to make the city make certain kinds of choices. And I don't think that these things are necessarily mutually exclusive of each other. What I'm trying to say, that it kind of goes back to the climate model. The climate model that didn't have the high latitudes wasn't necessarily a terrible model. It just wasn't a complete model. And we just didn't understand how incomplete it was until we began to include the high latitudes. And then we said, well, actually, these are the more important places. We kind of could have managed without Brazil, actually, or without Equatorial Guinea or something like that. But trying to manage without Barrow, Alaska is actually a lot more damaging than trying to do without this thing. So I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, but I would contend that it is definitely doable, and it's substantially easier than any other approach that you might take.
Sure, Sanjay.
To add,
We'll get back.
yeah, just to add to, I think what Ashwin's saying and what he's alluding to is also, I think for far too long we've avoided working with elected officials. Because of the skepticism that has come up within the community that you really can't trust him. But I think there is one of the fundamental reforms that needs to happen of how people view government and governance is to be participatory in all aspects. The transparency aspects of it, the participatory aspects of it, the accountability. Every step of the way there has to be, I mean, a great example, the Town and Country Planning Act in the state of Karnataka only requires you to have one public consultation when the plan is notified. It doesn't say how many, but it says minimum of one. So what the agency does, after the plan is drafted, it's put out for public comments, and they say, yeah, we met the legal requirement of putting it up. But it's the spirit of participation and goes back to the fact that the communities have to be involved at all scales of decision making, at the input, the throughput, and at the output, at every level of the governance, because that is the fundamental basis of by the people that the government has to function. And that's the enabling role that they have to play.
So, the two issues that come through, I'm not going to go back to Sanjeev. The issue is, do we need to get people back into the city? And it's about also getting politics back into the city. And in some senses, it looks as if, as you said, a lot of those lovely planners who have come in with central parks and wispy trees are not really politically embedded in the city. So let's get out of this table and get the room into the, at least get the people into the room. And so what do people think? Can you get politics back into the city? Is governing a city too complex to be left to the people?
No. Henk Ovink. I work for the Dutch and US government at the same time. An example of collaboration across at least the Atlantic. Working in the northeastern region after Hurricane Sandy, it was exactly about the inclusive leadership of government to let go, to not step in and say, this is the vision we have, but also not to step out of the way of the people, the NGOs, the market, the businesses, science, designers, or technology. It was exactly creating together with all those partners a platform for collaboration. And I think leadership on all sides, not only on government or on citizens or on designers or on scientists, is actually about having the capacity of this inclusive approach by setting a stage where you all step in and not only put in your dollars, but also your science, your data, your design and thinking and your vision, and be able to, as we say in the Netherlands, polder, but that's not reaching for a middle, but it's actually aiming for the top, but in a collaborative, inclusive way. So I think in the middle of what all you're saying is that if you give in a little of what your neighbor is actually enabling, you might get to a better governing city. But if you actually point to either the government or the citizens or the scientists or the developers to play the part by themselves, you will fail. So inclusive leadership is letting go.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Arnau Gutierrez. I'm from the province of Barcelona, which chairs one of the committees, one of the UCLG committees, the Committee on Decentralization and Local Governance. And well, I have many reflections and reactions, but I also want to pose a quick question. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Very short. Basically, we've been talking about these local global tensions and the debate about how to govern the futures. But I think we're missing an institution like UCLG, like United Cities and Local Governments, especially when dealing with the constraints of local urban regulations and how do we translate these constraints at international level. And I think that this organization is the one interacting with UN agencies. So we've seen several experiences, and I have the feeling that at international level, local governments went from twinnings to projects to networks, and now we should be talking about institutions. Aren't we forgetting about this institutionalization of local governments at the global stage in order to contribute to these debates? Thank you.
We have a question over here in the back, there, the woman right there.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for such a dense reflection on governance challenges in cities. My name is Shelly, and I'm from Global Development Network, Delhi. My question is, as I learned from the discussion so far, that there have been lots of focus on skills building and capacity building at local level, ward level, and also in terms of building innovative ideas so that city challenges can really be dealt with. My question is, do we really, at the stage of implementation, actually look into the local evidence-based research which would work and help implement challenges or to deal with the challenges for implementers themselves? Maybe they're not aware of what is working at the ground level. Implementers generally go for the solutions from consulting agencies. I think what is more prime is to know what is happening on the local ground, and that sort of information is required. Thank you.
I had a question around this concept of resilience, participation, and the time frame involved to make things happen. For example, if we take the current project, I think you shared a very cogent framework which Rockefeller has put together, where we're talking about resilience as a broad concept. We're also talking about a 3-year time frame in which you're expecting the cities to deliver. So, and we're talking about participation. So, my limited experience with the urban space has been faced with a response of that this is a very complex space, it takes a lot of time to look at traction on the ground, and any solution is really going to it takes a lot to make things happen more in the urban than in the rural space. So how are you personally, Michael, and the others on the panel looking at the concept of time in terms of making some of this happen? Do you see this as a 3-year time frame? Do you see this as 10 years? Do you see this as a much longer process? Because we spoke about the process, but what indicators would we look at, hitting in, say, a 5-year framework?
We've been hearing that cities are organic. We do know Indian cities are quite informal. So what's the solution? Do we formalize everyone? And if we formalize everyone, then have we considered the challenges of this formalization in terms of economic growth, in terms of provision of services, in terms of housing? I think there's a huge challenge out there. And just very quickly, that I think governance is also about a fear factor. And there is, I believe that local governments have the capacity, but they are unable to exercise some of their choices or creativity or innovativeness because their systems don't permit that to happen. So how do we get rid of the fear in them to be flexible, to be equitable, to achieve the goals that are needed?
My name is Sunaina. I'm from Hazard Center. One is the question about public-private partnerships and how efficient they really are. in terms of following the policies laid out for them and the lack of policies actually laid out for public-private partnerships. Giving the example of Katputli colony again, which some people raised this morning, the contract actually was signed for 2,700 flats, EWS flats, to be built for the residents, whereas the actual number of residents there, the families there, is 3,400 families. So this brings me to the point of what is being under-promised versus what is being over-promised, because on one hand, people were told for 5 years that they don't have to pay any money for the flats they're going to get because a builder is getting 1 hectare of land to build those houses for them. Today, they're told that they have to pay 5 lakh rupees for those houses, and the builders are getting more and more subsidies from the government. So who's being over-promised and who's being under-promised here is my question.
Thank you for the session. I just wanted to connect back with the theme on governing through partnerships. I was wanting to understand, for urban futures, does partnership with the education sector matter? Especially since we understand that our cities of today have been planned by planners not necessarily educated the right way, as well as designers and architects. So does education, partnerships in education matter for urban futures?
So why don't we go around for a minute here and respond? There are a number of different themes, and then we can open it up. I mean, a couple of them, one was the issue of time and how one addresses the issue of time. And I think the other is, particularly with many of those who represent big institutions here, whether it's C40, Rockefeller, Bloomberg, not representing Deutsche Bank, but many of the institutions, Bombay First, this corporate sector, is this whole question about institutional change and flexibility, and how do you build into what you're doing that there is the systemic and long-term change to what happens, what's beyond just, maybe there's a very successful initiative that's been done in Philadelphia, my home city, but that change will go beyond Mayor Nutter's term when he leaves in a year, or beyond, what happens, how does a resilience officer get the support if he's put into a system that doesn't work? How do you deal with that? So I think this question of flexibility, systemic change, bringing in local knowledge, and time, maybe those are some themes that some of you could hit on. And
just supplement,
please, yeah.
Andy, on time. Part of this process is going to be about building trust across government, across people, across the corporates. And we just heard about Katputli colony, where obviously the lack of trust between the people on the ground and the people who are planning to deliver. And trust doesn't come easy, especially in environments where people have not always been given what they have been promised. So how do you build that into your time frame? Because in some senses I see, especially in countries like India, as we start to move into new forms of governance, people wonder, is this new form of governance a search for a better future? And a better future for whom? And am I going to be part of that ride? Okay. So how do we factor in the time that would be needed to build that trust?
Should we start, maybe, Michael, let me start with you and just go around.
So I do think to this point that it's a real tension between, and not just for us, for almost everyone involved, that building, resilience, livability, sustainability, whatever you are going for, takes real time. The most you can do in a year or two is change the street furniture. I mean, if you are talking about healing the wounds of sectarian conflict, or making neighborhoods whole again, or restoring the wetlands or aquifers or whatever, that's a generations project. And that's what real change is about. That's really what it is. And yet, our commissioners are getting rotated every 3 years. Our chief ministers are out after 5. Our mayors are up for re-election every 4 years if you're in a directly elected mayoralty. So all of those actors need to have both long-term, real, holistic planning, the kind of, and some short-term wins. And how do you balance those two things, not to just pluck the low-hanging fruit, but also not to say, we need plans and studies for the next 10 years, and then we'll think about how to fund something for the 10 years after that. And so those are the things that I don't think there's any easy answer, but those are the things that I think people who are trying to fundamentally change cities are wrestling with.
Well, there are two things, really. One is, who is the one person that you can think of who really has a long-term interest and is likely to be in the same situation over a long period of time? That's a citizen. And who is the person who experiences the integrated outcome of all the different departments rather than their silos of public administration? Again, the citizen. So this is really what I'm going to do. And I'm saying, on the question of trust, what Andy was referring to, and also the question about that project that was referred, I forget the exact name of it. I think that if you build a system that assumes that people cannot be trusted to do what's good for each other by mutual cooperation, you will actually end up with the kind of problem that she's talking about. Because essentially what happens in such a scenario is that government steps in and says, since neighbor A cannot trust neighbor B, and there's no reason to think that B can trust A either, I'm going to arbitrate the trust relationship between the two of them, and that arbitration of the trust relationship is very vulnerable to being hijacked by all kinds of interest groups. It's much easier and much more likely to produce good examples if you say, well, I'm going to trust communities to do what's right for themselves by mutual consultation. Is it likely that some of them will result in bad outcomes? Yes. But is it also likely that the good outcomes will become examples that drive subsequent action across larger sections of society? The answer to that also is yes. And that's why we need to bet on a model that starts from trust.
So let me just ask you, go ahead, Mike.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
So I agree with all that, but it's also who's the one who gets fed up with the BRT pilot and throws it out before it's really demonstrated success? It's also the citizen in some ways, right? And so that's the complexity, is that it's also the citizens who are chucking out leaders who don't show some quick wins and real benefit year in and year out. And so that's the nuanced balance between some top-down and bottom-up that has to be walked.
I just want to add, go ahead.
Hold on.
Go ahead.
But in your sort of analysis of the situation, the BRT project pre-exists. In my analysis of the situation, the BRT project would only exist if there was sufficient demand for solving the problem in that way to begin with. You can't postulate the existence of a particular way of solving things and then ask, well, would this be acceptable to citizens? I'm saying the ways in which we choose to solve things should themselves emanate from a much different understanding of how problems ought to be solved. And I'm going to go back to saying it's not easy. But this is actually easier than anything else that we think we can do.
I want to ask you one question, just pick up, sorry, quickly, and then we keep going around, but from this morning that came up that just reminded me, which was when we were talking at the first session about decentralization, and the sort of challenge that on the one hand, the government passed an amendment but didn't really result in real empowerment of cities. On the other hand, citizens, communities are indifferent about really changing. There's not a demand from communities to change governance. But there's an urgency, right? Urbanization's happening, there's an urgency for change. So how do you get the urgency in people? What will motivate people to demand the kind of change that in urban governance and empowerment that you envision? What will motivate that? And why hasn't it happened? Or isn't it happening?
They're actually quite motivated. I did hear some other people say that people are already ready. I think we did the 74th Amendment wrong too, and the JNUR mission subsequently, which was supposed to implement it on the ground in the last 5 to 7 years. And I think what we did wrong was that we sort of put financial devolution at the very end of that pipeline. You should have moved the money down the system first, and all the other things would have happened subsequently if you'd done that first. Today you're telling people you have a voice, you have a right, you have everything, except that you don't get to make any budgetary decision as to how money should be used. We have to figure out a way to bring the money to the choices that people would make around that money, and then the rest of it will become that much more energetic.
Thank you.